very recently seen early data from a clinical trial with a coronavirus vaccine. And these data made me feel even more confident that we will be able to deliver a few 100 million doses of vaccine by the end of 2020.
That was one of President Trump's new vaccine czars with his hopes for a COVID-19 vaccine. Wall Street's placing its bets on one of those trials after Moderna Therapeutics announced promising results this week from its phase 1 vaccine test. The pharmaceutical company, which is working with the federal agency led by Dr. Anthony Fauci, is receiving more than $400 million in government money to develop a coronavirus cure. Moderna is one of a dozen companies developing a vaccine, but it's actually the first to make claims about its trial results. The company says its data shows the 8 patients developed antibodies for COVID-19. Sarah Owermohle is a health reporter covering drug policy for Politico, and she joins me now. So, Sarah, I know you cover this industry in depth. What degree of confidence should we really look at Moderna's apparent trial results? Is it really looking like we could potentially get a vaccine by the end of the year?
Right, yeah, so it is promising, but it's very early. Like you said, there were just 8 patients. There were actually more patients in that trial, but they wanted to share that right away given the urgency of the situation. So we're still going to learn more about those other patients. What we know right now is that 8 of those patients developed an antibody response, which means that the basics of that vaccine, letting your body recognize what this is and be able to fight it, are happening, but there's going to be a lot more questions down the line that need to be answered in phase 2 and phase 3 trials. Those trials generally will enroll hundreds to thousands of people and take months to complete. They're going to hopefully deliver answers on safety, on how effective this is, who it is effective for, and how long the immune response lasts. It's phase 3 where a lot of drugs and vaccines fail or we find out risks that we hadn't seen before. So it's really going to be that phase, which they're aiming to start in July, where we're going to get more of the answers. But to your second question about whether we could see a vaccine this year, we could if all of that goes right, but it's a tricky game. And then we get to the next step, which is how to get it out to people.
I want to ask you about that. You report sort of on the difficulties of just trying to develop, once a vaccine is developed. Part of this has to do with who gets it first. How do they make that determination of who to get to it first, and what does that process really look like?
Yes, that's a very complicated process. Generally speaking, in outbreak situations, whether it be flu or Ebola in West Africa, they will go and administer it to healthcare workers first. And that makes a lot of sense because those are the frontline workers, and they need to be protected in order to treat people who are still sick. And so that's generally what happens first. After that, it becomes more complicated. It has to do with what kind of virus you're dealing with, who is most at risk, and where the need really is. And so in the past, there have been pushes to prioritize the elderly or children or pregnant women or people who work in really high exposure areas. In this current pandemic, that would be people who work at grocery stores or meat plants who are being infected at very high rates. In the past, we have let states make the decisions about who their priority lists are, but increasingly there have been calls for the federal government to start laying this out themselves. One major concern, though, is that the way that the Trump administration has approached allotting resources during this pandemic has some people worried that outright healthcare ones.
You mentioned the Trump administration's approach to this, and if there are calls for the federal government to intervene over states, how did the politics play out with the distribution of remdesivir? That was another drug used to treat COVID-19 patients as well.
Exactly. So that's the first one that we know of that has been effective against COVID-19, and there are not that many doses of it available. It's quite a complicated drug to make, and so a few 100,000 doses were donated to the federal government, who said it would allot it itself to hospitals, actually not even just necessarily to the state governments, but straight to the hospitals that felt it needed it, those doses in. And so the federal government has plenty of data on what infections rates are, what the hot spots are, but they didn't make it entirely clear why they were making the decisions that they were. And then it became this confusing sort of situation where some hospitals weren't getting it or didn't know whether they were eligible to get it, there was immediate blowback and criticism. And the Trump administration has since admitted that it probably didn't use the best data to make those decisions. So people point at that, which is a much more modest rollout than any vaccine would be, because that was a few 100,000 doses. This would be billions. And they worry that we're not going to have a transparent process that your average person can look at and say, I understand why this is happening. I understand why this person is getting the vaccine before me.
You know, another aspect I want to ask you about, once this vaccine is made, I've heard people who are developing these vaccines talk about how they're creating extra doses, even though they don't even know whether it'll work, just so then they can distribute that if it does work in that final stage. Once this vaccine is made, how do they reach that scale? You report on concerns with the nation's supply chain, but what challenges will the U.S. face in trying to build that stockpile of a potential vaccine?
Right, they are trying to address that right now. So something really unprecedented is happening. Normally, pharmaceutical manufacturers won't actually start scaling up manufacturing until they know for certain that what they have is going to be approved and it's going to be used. And so instead of doing that and waiting, the federal government is pouring almost $1 billion into trying to scale up for both Moderna, which had those positive results this week, and Johnson & Johnson, which is another candidate that is far along as well, although not as far as Moderna. And the idea there is that if these do work, we immediately have doses available and there won't be lag time, because we're going to need hundreds of millions of doses just for the US, but we have to consider that everyone in the world is going to want this once it's available. And there's immediate concerns, not just with the chemicals that you would need to make a vaccine, but things like glass vials and stoppers and syringes, where there's not really massive markets to begin with, and we need to stockpile the things that are needed so that we don't get to a situation where we know that we have a solution and we just can't get it to people.
It's a fascinating look, great reporting. Sarah Owermohle, I'm so grateful you could join us to discuss the creation of a vaccine.
Thank you for having me.